Maplewood hadn't changed much in 50 years. The same brick municipality with white columns, the same single traffic light at the intersection of Center and Maple Streets, the same Joe's Diner that served the best pancakes in the county. 40 minutes away, Philadelphia was bustling, but here, time seemed to slow down, frozen in the amber of provincial coziness. The spring sun touched the rooftops affectionately as Emily Decker stretched in her bed. The sheriff's 19-year-old daughter put aside the novel she'd been reading into the night, another tale of forbidden love, passion, and overcoming obstacles. Emily sighed, imagining herself in the heroine's shoes. Her room was like a dreamer's sanctuary, shelves of romantic books, posters of love movies, sketchbooks in which she poured out her fantasies. "Emily, breakfast is ready." Her father's voice brought her back to reality. "Coming, Dad." Sheriff Robert Decker, a tall man with graying dark hair, was frying bacon when his daughter came down to the kitchen. His uniform hung on the back of a chair, impeccably ironed. "Good morning, sleepyhead. Been reading until dawn again?" He smiled, but there was the usual worry in his eyes. Since his wife's death 10 years ago, Robert had raised his daughter alone. To all of Maplewood, he was a paragon of justice and reliability, but at home he turned into a hen, overprotective of his only child. "Are you going to college today?" he asked, putting scrambled eggs on his daughter's plate. "Yes, I have lectures until 3. Then I wanted to stop by the library." Emily picked up a piece of bacon with her fork. "I get off at 5. I can pick you up." "Dad?" She rolled her eyes. "I can take the bus, like normal people. I'm in charge of safety in this town." He raised his eyebrows jokingly, but there was real concern behind the joke. Emily didn't argue. In 21st century suburban Philadelphia, she lived like a princess in a tower. Her father knew about all her movements, checked on her friends, disapproved of her parties, and she didn't date at all. There was no one to go out with. In a town where everyone had known each other since childhood, Emily remained the sheriff's daughter, to whom guys were afraid to approach. After eating breakfast, she kissed her father on the cheek and was about to leave when the doorbell rang. "Delivery for Emily Decker," a deep male voice said as she opened the door. Emily froze. A man in an Amazon uniform stood before her, tall, shouldering, with 3-day stubble and eyes the color of stormy skies. His arms were covered in faded tattoos, and a scar was visible on his left wrist. He held a small box and a clipboard for signature. "Is this for me?" She reached out her hand for the package in confusion. "I didn't order anything." "Emily Decker, 12 Maple Street." He checked the delivery note. "Sender, Old Cover Book Store." "Oh, that's Aunt Martha," Emily remembered. Her mother's sister sometimes spoiled her with surprises. The man held out the clipboard, and as Emily signed, their fingers accidentally touched. She felt her cheeks redden. "Thank you," she murmured. "You're welcome," he nodded, turning toward the van with the Amazon logo on it. "Are you new?" she blurted out. I haven't seen you before." He turned around. "Transferred from Philly 3 months ago. Jake." He didn't say his last name. At that moment, Sheriff Decker came out of the house, holstered. "What's going on here?" "Just a delivery, Dad," Emily answered hurriedly. "From Aunt Martha." The sheriff gave Jake a professional look, as if he were taking pictures for a file cabinet height, weight, special features. Jake endured the stare without a shadow of embarrassment. "Good morning, Sheriff." He nodded with an impenetrable expression and got into the van. Robert turned to his daughter as the vehicle rounded the corner. "Don't talk to strangers any more than you have to, Em. He's just a courier, Dad." "I don't know him. And newcomers to our town can't always be trusted." In college, Emily couldn't concentrate on her lectures. The image of the mysterious delivery man was in her mind's eye. She found a delivery tracking app on her phone and looked at the schedule. Jake was supposed to be delivering orders on the north side of town today. After class, instead of the library, she went to the Green Maple Cafe on the north end. Sitting at the window with her psychology textbook, she watched the street with an edge of her eye. At exactly 4 o'clock, a blue van pulled up in front. Jake unloaded a few boxes and headed toward a nearby store. On the way back, he stopped at a cafe, apparently for coffee, and spotted Emily. "Hi," he said, approaching her table. "Did you like the package?" "A set of classics," she smiled, glad she hadn't lied. She'd gotten a collector's edition of Jane Austen from her aunt. Do you come to this neighborhood often? Tuesday and Thursday on schedule. He held up a cup of coffee. Are you in school? Psychology at the community college. She pointed to a textbook. And you, only do deliveries? It was an odd question for a first conversation, but Emily couldn't help her curiosity. Right now, yes, he answered with a slight chuckle. Why? Just... She hesitated. There are already rumors about you in town. You know, it's a small town. What are they saying? His eyes narrowed a little bit. That you're ex-military. That you have some mysterious history. She blushed, realizing how stupid that sounded. People need something to gossip about. He sipped his coffee. But yeah, I served. Iraq, Afghanistan. Nothing mysterious. The conversation was interrupted by his work phone ringing. I gotta go. 10 more deliveries before the end of the shift. He headed for the exit, but turned around at the door. You shouldn't believe the rumors, Emily, including rumors about me. That evening at dinner, the sheriff was unusually quiet. Dad, what's wrong? Emily asked, noticing the wrinkle between his eyebrows. Nothing much, just making inquiries about some new people in town. He set his fork aside. That courier from this morning, have you seen him before? No, she answered honestly. Why? Nothing, just checking, he sighed. You know, since Mom's gone. Dad, it's been 10 years, Emily interrupted softly. You can't protect me forever. I can and I will, he said firmly, as long as you're under my roof. I'm 19, she objected. Other girls my age have long since. The other girls are not my daughters, the sheriff said, and they have different fathers. I know this world better than you do, Emily. I know what people are capable of. She turned away, feeling the familiar heaviness. Her father's love was like a blanket under which it was impossible to breathe. For the next 2 weeks, Emily deliberately arranged her routes so that she would accidentally cross paths with Jake. She learned that he was 33, that he rented a small trailer on the outskirts of town, that he liked black coffee without sugar and read history books. Every conversation they had was short, but each time revealed a new facet of this strange, closed-off man. Jake never talked about the past, avoided questions about his family and his reasons for moving to Maplewood. But sometimes there was something like tenderness in his eyes when Emily shared her naive dreams. There was already talk in town about the sheriff's daughter's strange friendship with the delivery boy. Carol Baker, a neighbor and longtime friend of the Decker family, intercepted Emily outside the house one day. Honey, be careful, she said, nodding toward the departing delivery van. Your father's worried sick. We're just talking, Mrs. Baker, Emily defended herself. Of course we are, dear. Carol pressed her lips together. But you have to understand what it looks like. You're the sheriff's daughter and he's... Rumor has it, he wasn't discharged from the army of his own accord. Rumors are just rumors, Emily said, surprised at her own audacity. But deep down, she knew that what had begun as innocent curiosity was growing into something more. For the first time in her life, Emily felt the thrill of mystery, the taste of the forbidden. Jake was the opposite of everything her father had personified. A rebel against order, freedom against control, the unknown against predictability. And every time she met him, she took a step further away from the protected world Sheriff Decker had so carefully built for her. May was unusually warm in Maplewood. The trees were dressed in lush foliage, and the air was filled with the scent of lilacs. For Emily, it was a spring of discovery. Every meeting with Jake opened the veil of mystery of this strange, closed man. Their meetings became regular. Thursday afternoons at the Green Maple, Saturdays at the town fair, the occasional random crossing at the supermarket. They talked about everything and nothing in particular. Jake listened to her stories about college, dreams of becoming a psychologist, favorite books. Emily absorbed the rare, fragmentary stories about his service, the far-flung countries he'd been to. You never talk about your family, she remarked one day as they sat on a park bench. The May sun was golden in his profile, emphasizing his sharp features. Jake was silent for a long moment before he answered. Because she's gone, he said quietly. My parents died when I was 20. My brother, he hesitated. A younger brother, too. I'm sorry. Emily touched his arm gently. I didn't know. It was a long time ago. He shrugged, but she noticed his jaw tense. I'm on my own now. It's easier that way. And friends? The girl? She was surprised at her own boldness. Jake looked at her with a slight chuckle. Are you always this curious? I'm sorry, she blushed. I'm just trying to understand you. Why? His gaze became serious. I don't know, she answered honestly. Maybe because you're unlike anyone else in this town. You're real. Their eyes met, and Emily felt something change between them, as if an invisible wall had cracked. Sheriff Decker couldn't help but notice the change in his daughter. She had become absent-minded, looking at her phone a lot, coming up with strange reasons to leave the house. Robert knew the signs. His little girl was in love. Who are you texting so often? He asked at dinner one night. With Jessica discussing a project, Emily lied without blinking an eye. Interesting, the sheriff said. Then why did Jessica just call your home phone and ask where you've been? Emily froze with her fork to her mouth. Dad, I'm an adult. I can hang out with whoever I want. Of course you can, he nodded. And I have a right to know who my daughter hangs out with, especially if it's someone with a questionable past. What are you talking about? She felt her heart beat faster. About the Amazon courier. Robert set the instruments aside. Jake Morrison, former Marine sergeant, served in hot spots, discharged after an incident in Afghanistan. Details are classified, but I heard it was something serious. Did you check him out? Emily was outraged. It's my job to check out suspicious individuals, the sheriff said firmly, especially those who hang around my daughter. He's not hanging around me. We're just talking. He's twice your age, Emily, Robert sighed. Men like that only have one thing on their minds when they're with young girls. God, Dad. She jumped up from the table. You see everyone as a criminal. Maybe that's why I've never had a boyfriend. Everybody's afraid to go near the sheriff's daughter. And they're right to be, he muttered. I'm 19! Emily exclaimed. You can't control my life forever! She ran out of the kitchen, slamming the door loudly. In her room, Emily pulled out her cell phone and texted Jake. Can we meet tomorrow? Need to talk. They met at a lake outside of town, a small pier, old willows leaning against the water, a place that looked like it had stepped out of the pages of the romance novels Emily loved so much. Father found out about us, she said at once. Or rather, he suspects. He's been checking into your past. Jake tensed. And what did he find out? That you were in the Marines, that you were discharged after some incident in Afghanistan. She looked at him carefully. Is that true? Partly. He turned away, looking at the water. I did serve, and I did get discharged after an incident, but not exactly the way he thinks. Can you tell me? Not now, Emily, he shook his head. Maybe someday, but you should know that I would never hurt you. Never. She took a step toward him. I believe you. Jake looked at her, very young, trusting, with eyes full of the kind of innocent adoration he didn't deserve. He should have stopped it, should have pushed her away. But instead, he slowly leaned in and kissed her. The world around Emily spun. It was her first real kiss, not the awkward attempts of boys at a school party, but the kiss of a man who knew what he was doing. Her heart was pounding so frantically that it felt like it was about to jump out of her chest. When they pulled away from each other, Jake ran his finger along her cheek. We shouldn't do this. Why not? She whispered. Because your father's right. I'm not the man you should be with. I get to decide who I'm with, Emily said stubbornly. And I choose you. For the next 2 weeks, they met in secret. Emily lied to her father, saying she was studying at the library or visiting friends. She and Jake drove to neighboring towns, walked in the woods, talked for hours. He opened up gradually, talking about his service, about the countries he'd been to, even about his childhood, but never about why he'd moved to Maplewood. Each encounter ended with longer kisses, bolder touches. Emily felt a new, unfamiliar desire growing inside her. Jake was reserved, never crossed a certain line, but she could see the fire in his eyes. One evening they were sitting in his trailer on the outskirts of town. The rain drummed on the roof, creating a cozy cocoon of sounds. Jake had made pasta. Turns out he was a pretty good cook. They ate, drank wine for the first time in Emily's life, and listened to old rock from his vinyl collection. "Why did you choose Maplewood?" she asked as they sat on the small couch, huddled together. "A fluke," he answered after a pause. "I was looking for a quiet place." She sensed he wasn't telling her the whole story, but she didn't press. "You know, I've never been happier," Emily admitted, turning to him. "For the first time in my life, I feel free." Jake looked at her carefully. His eyes seemed almost black in the darkness of the trailer. "You deserve more than I can give you," he said quietly. "I ask for nothing more than this moment." She reached for him. Their kiss started gently, but quickly grew into something deeper, more demanding. Jake's hand slid under her shirt, and Emily shuddered at the new sensation. "I'm sorry," he pulled away immediately. "No, it's okay." She took his hand and put it back where it belonged. I never... Are you sure?" He looked serious, giving her a chance to pull back. Instead of answering, she kissed him. What happened next was a mixture of awkwardness and revelation, pain and pleasure, fear and trust. Jake was patient and gentle, but Emily still felt lost in the new sensations. When it was over, they lay cuddled together, listening to the silence of the rain outside. "Are you okay?" he asked, kissing the top of her head. "Yes." She snuggled tighter. "It was different than I'd imagined." He laughed softly. "They embellish everything in novels. But I liked it," she added hastily. "It just takes some getting used to." They were silent for a moment, and then Emily said, "You know, I've never even been on a real date before you. Dad's been scaring everyone away. He's just protecting you." "Overprotective," she sighed. "After Mom died, he got it into his head that the world was a dangerous place. He kept me away from parties, checked up on all my friends, made me accountable for every move. I grew up in a golden cage. I even had to choose the closest college so I could live at home." Jake listened silently, stroking her hair. "Sometimes I don't think he realizes how much he's smothering me with his care," Emily continued. "I love him. I really do. He's a good man and a great sheriff. But I suffocate around him." "And with me?" Jake asked. "With you, I feel like I can breathe," she smiled. "You don't try to control me or tell me what to do. You just accept me for who I am." Something flashed in his eyes, either pain or regret. But he quickly hid it behind a smile and kissed her. Sheriff Robert Decker sat in his office, looking at the picture of his daughter on his desk. Emily had lied to him again, saying she was spending the night at a friend's house. He called Jessica's mother under the pretense of clarifying the time he would pick up his daughter, and learned that Emily wasn't there. Carol Baker, stopping by with a homemade pie, found him in a somber mood. "What's wrong, Rob?" she asked, setting the pie on the table. "Emily," he sighed. "She's out with that courier, I'm sure of it." Carol gloomed. "Have you talked to her?" "I tried. She only shuts down more. I don't know what to do, Carol." He rubbed his temples. "For the first time in my life, I don't know how to protect my own daughter." "Maybe we should talk to him," she suggested. "Explain the situation? What would I say? Stay away from my daughter?" That would only push her toward him. The sheriff shook his head. "No, that's not what we're going to do. I'll do more research on him. If he's involved in something nefarious, I'll find it." "And if he isn't?" Carol asked quietly. "Then I'll have to accept that my girl has grown up." Robert smiled sadly. Carol looked at him for a long time before she said, "Rob, I've known you for almost 20 years. I've never seen you so worried. Morrison's hiding something." The sheriff frowned. "I can feel it. And I don't want Emily to get hurt because of my miscalculations." "Miscalculations?" Carol raised an eyebrow. "It doesn't matter." He waved his hand. "I'm just worried about my daughter." Carol squeezed his hand silently. Emily spent the weekend with Jake. They spent Saturday walking in a neighboring town and then returned to his trailer in the evening. When she awoke in the night, she saw Jake sitting at his desk, studying some papers. Noticing she was awake, he quickly put them away. "Work?" Emily asked sleepily. "Just something personal," he smiled. "Sleep." Sunday morning, Jake was unusually pensive. They were eating breakfast on the small veranda of the trailer when he said, "Emily, there's something I have to tell you." "What?" She looked up from her toast. "I didn't come to Maplewood by accident." Emily froze. "What do you mean?" "I was looking for someone who might be able to shed some light on an old story," he said slowly, choosing his words. 15 years ago, my younger brother died under strange circumstances. Officially, an accident, but I always knew the truth was hidden. What's Maplewood got to do with it? She felt a chill run down her spine. Jake stared at her for a long moment before answering. "Your father was the officer who investigated my brother's death at Cedar Grove." Emily felt the ground go from under her feet. "What? No, that's impossible. After Timothy died, the case was quickly closed, and your father was soon transferred here to Maplewood. I spent years gathering information, trying to figure out what really happened. You're telling me that my father—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I don't know exactly what happened," Jake said quietly. "But your father was the last person to see Timothy alive, and the first to find his body." Emily jumped up, feeling everything inside her turn upside down. "Is that why you're with me? To get to my father?" "No!" Jake grabbed her hands. "I didn't know who you were at first. When I did, I thought I'd use it to get closer to the sheriff. But then, everything changed. I fell in love with you, Emily. For real. I don't believe it." She pulled her hands away. "You've been lying to me all this time." "Not about everything." He looked at her pleadingly. "What's between us is real, I swear." Emily grabbed her bag and ran out of the trailer, not listening to Jake calling her name. Tears covered her eyes as she got into the car. The man she'd opened her heart to, shared her most intimate things with, was using her as a pawn in his game against her father. At home, Emily locked herself in her room. The phone was ringing off the hook with Jake's calls, but she didn't answer it. She needed time to process what she'd heard. Could what Jake had said be true? Was her father involved in his brother's death? That evening, the sheriff knocked on her door. "Emily, are you all right?" "Yeah." She wiped away her tears. "Just tired." "Are you sure?" There was concern in his voice. "You seem upset." "Dad?" She paused. "Did you ever work in a town called Cedar Grove?" There was silence outside the door. "How do you know?" he finally asked. "Just answer," Emily insisted. "Yes," the sheriff said slowly. "Before he moved here." "Emily, what's going on? Did you know Timothy Morrison?" The question came out before she could think. The door opened abruptly. The sheriff stood in the doorway, pale as a sheet. "Who told you?" "Jake," she answered quietly. "His real name is Morrison. He's Timothy's brother." Robert Decker sank slowly onto his daughter's bed. "I knew he came here for a reason. He says you were the last person to see his brother alive." Emily looked at her father, trying to see the truth in his eyes. "Is that true?" The sheriff was silent for a long moment before answering. "Yes, I saw Timothy that night. Patrolling by the lake, I spotted him with another guy, the mayor's son. They were drinking, making noise. I gave them a warning and left. 2 hours later, I got a call, body in the lake. What happened next?" An investigation was launched. The mayor's son claimed Timothy went swimming alone and he'd already left. But the evidence said otherwise. Robert sighed heavily. "I was pulled off the case when I started digging too deep, and then they told me to leave town, for your safety." "So we ran away?" Emily asked incredulously. "We started a new life," her father corrected gently. "I couldn't risk you. After Mom died, you were all I had left." They sat in silence for a long time, digesting each other's revelations. "What are you going to do about Jake?" Emily finally asked. "I'll talk to him," the sheriff said, rubbing his face tiredly. "I'll tell him what I know. I never wanted his brother's death to go unpunished." "I want to be there too," Emily said firmly. Robert looked at his daughter carefully. "Are you in love with him?" "I was." She looked away. "Now I don't know." Monday morning was gray and cool. Emily lay awake all night thinking about Jake, about her father, about the tangled history that had joined their fates. The sheriff entered her room at 7 in the morning. His face was pale, his eyes red from sleep. "Emily," He spoke softly but firmly. "We just got a call. In the trailer park." She felt her heart sink. "What happened?" "Jake Morrison was found dead in his trailer." The sheriff watched his daughter's reaction carefully. "Presumed murder." Emily looked at her father in shock. "No, this can't be this." "I've called a detective from the county," the sheriff continued. "Lisa Chang, the best specialist. She'll be here in an hour." "I'm coming with you." Emily jumped up from the bed. "No," her father said firmly. "You're staying home. This is a crime scene, Emily. And you were close to him. That makes you a suspect." She stared at her father incredulously. "Do you think I could have—" "No, of course not." The sheriff shook his head. "But procedure is procedure. Detective Chang will be talking to everyone who knew Jake, including you." He left the room, leaving Emily alone with the terrible news. Jake is dead. The man she'd loved, the man she'd hated for lying to her, the man she'd never had time to truly forgive or understand, he was gone. She remembered their last conversation, the accusations she'd thrown in his face. What if that had been their last meeting? What if he died thinking she hated him? By noon, Detective Lisa Chang, a short woman with a sharp, attentive gaze, showed up at their house. She settled herself in the living room, spreading out a notepad. "Miss Decker," she began, "I need to ask you some questions about Jake Morrison." "I've already told my father everything," Emily replied quietly. "Still," Chang insisted gently, "when was the last time you saw him?" "Yesterday morning." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "We had a fight. I found out that he came to Maplewood because of my father." The detective nodded, making notes. "The sheriff told me about your family history and connection to the Morrison family. That's a possible motive. But we need to look at all the leads." "Who would kill him?" Emily asked bluntly. "I don't know yet," Chang answered honestly. "The coroner puts the time of death between 10 p.m. and midnight. Single gunshot to the chest, close range, professional, quick." "Like the killer knew what he was doing," Emily whispered. The detective looked at her carefully. "Exactly. Someone who knows how to handle a gun. Do you suspect my father?" Emily raised her eyes to Chang. "I suspect anyone who might have a motive," she answered calmly, "including the people at Cedar Grove. Jake Morrison's story doesn't end in Maplewood. It began 15 years ago, by the lake." The Maplewood Police Department was buzzing like a beehive. Detective Lisa Chang, who had arrived from the county, had turned the empty conference room into her temporary headquarters. Crime scene photos, diagrams, timelines hung on the walls. At the center of it all was a portrait of Jake Morrison. Emily nervously rubbed the sleeve of her sweater as she sat in the interview room. Detective Chang entered with 2 glasses of coffee, one of which she placed in front of the girl. "I understand this is hard for you," Chang said, taking the seat across from her, "but I need to ask you some questions." "I've already told you everything," Emily said quietly. "Not quite everything." The detective opened a file folder. "You said you saw Jake on Saturday, and you never spoke to him again. But his phone records show that he called you on Sunday night, and the conversation lasted almost 20 minutes. Emily turned pale. I didn't want to tell." "Emily, Jake is dead," Chang said softly but firmly. "Whatever happened between you two could be important to the investigation right now." The girl took a deep breath. "He called late last night. Said he had something important to tell me. About my father. About why he'd really come to Maplewood." "And what exactly did he tell you?" "That 15 years ago, his younger brother Timothy drowned under strange circumstances. My father, then a police officer at Cedar Grove, was in charge of the investigation. The case was dismissed as an accident, but Jake always thought the truth had been covered up, that his brother was murdered." "And he suspected your father?" "Yes." Emily lowered her gaze. "He said he'd been gathering evidence against him for years, and then—" She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Said he'd initially gotten close to me to gain access to my father. Used me." "How did you react?" "Angry. Hung up. Disconnected the phone." Emily grinned wryly. "I wanted to forget him, and the next morning I found out he was dead." Chang tapped her pencil on the table thoughtfully. "Do you think your father could have found out about this conversation? About Jake's suspicions?" "No!" Emily looked at the detective indignantly. My father is not a murderer. He was home all night. Of course. Chang held up her hand reassuringly. I'm just checking all the leads, but who else did you tell about Jake's call? Emily hesitated. No one. Well, just Carol Baker. She came by Monday morning, brought blueberry muffins. She noticed I was upset and I shared. Interesting. Chang made a note in her notebook. And how did Mrs. Baker react? She said I was lucky to be rid of Jake, that Dad was right, and he wasn't the man I should be with. Emily frowned. Thinking back on it now, she looked strange, flustered, but I wrote it off as her usual concern. And how many hours after that conversation was Jake's body found? I don't know exactly. Emily started, and then suddenly froze, realizing, wait, do you think Carol had something to do with the murder? I don't think anything yet, Chang replied flatly. I'm just gathering information. Sheriff Decker studied the papers from Jake's trailer spread out on the table. There were newspaper clippings of Timothy Morrison's death, copies of police reports, tapes of eyewitness interviews, and a notebook of Jake's own notes, in which he methodically built an accusation against Robert Decker. He was persistent, Chang said as she entered the office. 15 years of searching for the truth. The truth, the sheriff chuckled bitterly. He was looking for confirmation of his story. He convinced himself from the beginning that I had something to do with his brother's death. Were you involved? The detective asked bluntly. Decker was silent for a long time, staring at the picture of Timothy Morrison, a smiling boy with red hair and freckles. Not the way he thought, the sheriff finally replied. I did investigate that case, and I was indeed the last person to see Timothy alive, aside from the actual killer. But I never harmed him. On the contrary, I tried to get to the truth. Which was? An accident during a fight, Decker sighed heavily. Timothy got into a fight with the mayor's son, Michael Preston. They were drinking by the lake, got into an argument. Timothy hit his head on a rock and passed out. Michael panicked and pushed him into the water to cover his tracks. Were you a witness? No. I was patrolling the neighborhood and I came upon Michael while he was still at the lake. I picked him up, he confessed. But before I could bring him in, his father, William Preston, mayor of Cedar Grove, intervened. A powerful man with a lot of connections. And what happened? Chang watched the sheriff closely. The case was dropped. Preston explained to me that it looked like an accident and there was no point in messing up two families. Put pressure on his superiors. Decker clenched his fists. When I kept pushing, the threats started. First me, then Emily. After my wife died, she was everything to me. I couldn't risk it. So you moved to Maplewood, the detective nodded. Yeah. Started a new life, hoping the past was behind me. He grinned bitterly. And then Jake Morrison showed up. Who thought you were guilty? That's right. Figured I'd helped cover it up by taking a bribe or giving in to pressure. Never considered the possibility that I was the victim. Chang tapped her pen on her notebook thoughtfully. What do we know about Jake? After his brother died, he immersed himself in the investigation, graduated from high school, joined the Army, served in the Marines, discharged 5 years ago, got his private investigator's license, worked in Philadelphia, the deputy reported, checking the paperwork. And all that time he was looking for evidence against me, Decker added grimly. When he finally found where I lived, he devised a whole plan, moved to Maplewood, created a cover story about working at Amazon, started gathering information. Then he used my daughter to get close. Do you think he was planning on having a relationship with Emily from the beginning? Chang asked. I don't know. The sheriff frowned. I hope he didn't. That it came out by accident, otherwise. He didn't finish the sentence, but his cheekbones were forming. Otherwise, it would be the perfect motive for murder, the detective finished calmly. A father defending his daughter's honor. No one would have convicted you. I didn't kill him, Decker said firmly. Though I'll admit I wanted to strangle him when I found out how he was using Emily. When exactly did you find out? Last night. Emily told me about his confession, his reasons for coming to Maplewood. And how did you react? Angry, of course. I was going to talk to him today. Find out why the hell he was following us. Decker sighed. But I got the message this morning that he was dead. That was it. Chang scrutinized the sheriff's face. You had motive? opportunity and skill, and an alibi, just the word of your daughter. Who won't lie for me if I'm guilty? Decker finished calmly. Emily hates lies. Even if I killed Jake, she wouldn't cover for me. Maybe, the detective agreed, but I'd have to look into other possibilities, like Carol Baker. Carol? The sheriff was surprised. What does she have to do with this? Emily told her about Jake's call, about his true motives. Chang bowed her head. A few hours later, Jake was found dead. And who found the body? Carol, Decker said slowly, realizing. She went into the pie trailer and found him. Convenient, isn't it? Chang slammed the notebook shut. I want to talk to Mrs. Baker and check out her house. Emily sat on her front porch with her hands on her knees. The events of the last few days had turned her life upside down. The man she'd come to love had turned out to be a liar with a dark agenda of his own. And now, he was dead. Her musings were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up. It was Carol Baker. Emily, dear, the woman came up on the porch with a basket of muffins. How are you holding up? I'm fine, Emily smiled strainedly. And you? It must be hard finding him. Oh, Carol set the basket on the table. Yes, it was awful. A young man like that, covered in blood. She shuddered. But you know, maybe it was for the best. For the best? Emily looked at her neighbor with a puzzled expression. I'm sorry if that sounded cruel. Carol sat down next to her. It's just, you deserve better than a man like that. He lied to you, used you to get to your father. How do you know that? Emily was wary. You told me yourself, sweetheart, Carol smiled. Yesterday morning. About his call, about his confession. Yes, but, you sound like you've known his motives for a long time. Carol froze for a moment, her smile trembling slightly. Just intuition, dear. I always sensed there was something wrong with him. And so did your father. But you young girls don't listen to your elders. Mrs. Baker. Lisa Chang's voice made both women turn around. The detective stood at the foot of the porch, Sheriff Decker and two officers beside her. To what do I owe the honor? Carol tensed. We'd like to ask you some questions about Jake Morrison, Chang said. And we'd like to take a look around your house. My house? Carol clasped her hands together nervously. Why? Routine inspection, the detective replied flatly. You found the body. You could have brought in evidence on clothing, shoes. Do you have a warrant? Carol asked abruptly. I get one in an hour. Chang raised an eyebrow slightly. But we can wait for it at the station if you prefer. Carol hesitated, her eyes traveling to the sheriff. Robert, is that really necessary? I'm afraid so, Carol, Decker said softly. Standard procedure. All right, she rose. Let's go to my place. Just give me a minute to pack. As Carol disappeared into the house, Chang turned to the sheriff. I don't like her reaction. Send an officer to make sure she doesn't get rid of the evidence. Carol Baker's house was the epitome of cozy. Lace doilies, a collection of porcelain figurines, crocheted plaids on the couches. Detective Chang and the forensics team methodically surveyed the rooms while the landlady watched tensely from her chair. May I offer you some tea? Carol asked as the pause lengthened. Or coffee? No, thank you, Chung declined. Mrs. Baker, when exactly did you meet Sheriff Decker? Almost 20 years ago when he and Emily moved to Maplewood. Carol frowned. But what did that have to do with the murder? Just getting the details. Chang made a note in her notebook. Did you know him before you moved here? No, of course not. Carol laughed nervously. I've lived in Maplewood all my life. That's odd, the detective raised an eyebrow. Because in the Cedar Grove archives, there's a reference to Carol Wilson living there 15 years ago, with a picture of you. Carol went pale. Yes, there was a time when I lived there, after my divorce, briefly. But I didn't meet Robert. What about the Morrison family, or the Prestons? Chang continued. No, Carol answered too quickly. I kept to myself. At that moment, one of the CSIs entered the room. Detective, we found this in the basement, behind the washing machine. He was holding a plastic bag with a gun in it. That's not mine, Carol exclaimed. I've never seen that gun before. Interesting, Chang examined the find. .45 caliber. Same caliber used to kill Jake Morrison. We'll run ballistics, but I bet it's a match. Carol jumped up, her face contorted. This is a setup. Someone planted it. Who, Mrs. Baker? Chang asked calmly. Who had access to your house? Who would want to set you up? Carol collapsed back into her chair, her shoulders slumped. You don't understand. I was protecting them. I was protecting Robert, Emily, their family. From Jake Morrison? Chang asked quietly. Yes, Carol looked up. He wanted to ruin their lives, dig up an old story that should have stayed buried. The story of his brother's death, the detective nodded. He didn't understand. Carol's voice sounded desperate. Robert wasn't responsible for Timothy's death. He tried to help, but he was silenced. The Prestons controlled the whole town. He had no choice but to leave and protect his daughter. How do you know that? Chang pitched forward. Carol swallowed. I was there. That night at the lake. I lived in a cabin nearby. I saw Michael Preston fighting with Timothy. I saw him fall and hit his head. Michael pushed him into the water. You were a witness, Chang stated. And you didn't say anything to the police? I was afraid, Carol exclaimed. The Prestons had the whole town in a tizzy. And then Officer Decker showed up, and I saw how he stood up to them, trying to get justice despite the threats. And fell in love with him, the detective guessed. Carol lowered her eyes. Yes, when he left, I couldn't stay in Cedar Grove. So I tracked down where he was going and I moved to Maplewood too. I wanted to be there for him, to support him. I saw him raising Emily alone, trying to protect her from the world. So when Jake showed up and started threatening that peace of mind, I had to do something. Carol gripped the armrests of her chair. He was going to ruin everything. He was going to get revenge on Robert for something he wasn't guilty of. He used poor Emily. And you decided to kill him, Chang finished. Carol nodded slowly. When Emily told me about his confession, I knew he was ready to act. I went to his trailer that night. I told him I knew the truth about his brother's death, that I could help him punish those responsible. And he believed you? Yeah, I told him I'd witnessed what I'd seen of Michael Preston. Jake was shocked. Carol smiled sadly. He was beginning to realize that he'd been wrong about Robert, that he'd been chasing the wrong man for years. And then you shot him? Chang made a note in her notebook. He was going to go to Robert, to tell him everything. Carol shook her head. I knew it would destroy the Decker family. The old memories, the guilt, the anger. It would kill Robert. Destroyed what he and Emily had. Is that why you thought it was better to kill an innocent man? He wasn't innocent, Carol objected. He used Emily, manipulated her feelings, broke her heart, and then came back in the morning and found the body, Chang finished. They faked shock, called the police. I was protecting them, Carol repeated quietly. Everything I did was for Robert and Emily. Emily sat in her father's car, staring silently at Carol's house where the police were bustling about. The sheriff, having finished talking to the officer, sat down next to his daughter. She confessed, he said quietly. Carol killed Jake. Why? Emily turned to her father, tears in her eyes. Because of you? Because of that old case? Because of both of us, Decker sighed heavily. She had a strange obsession with our family. She'd been following us ever since we left Cedar Grove. Thought she was protecting us. Protecting? By killing a man? In her mind, yes. The sheriff watched Carol being led in handcuffs to the police car. She was afraid the truth about her brother Jake's death would ruin our lives. What really happened, Dad? Emily stared intently at her father. Jake thought you were involved, that his brother's death wasn't an accident. Decker was silent for a long time, gathering his thoughts. Timothy Morrison died during a fight with Michael Preston, the mayor's son. He hit his head on a rock, lost consciousness. Michael panicked and pushed him into the water, faking an accident. I went on patrol and picked him up right by the lake. He confessed. And what happened next? His father intervened. William Preston, mayor of the town. A powerful man, the sheriff said with bitterness in his voice. He forced me to let my son go, keep the case quiet. When I refused, he started threatening me. First my career, then me, Emily finished quietly. Yeah, it was shortly after Mom died. Decker gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. I couldn't risk you, so I took the transfer to Maplewood, started a new life. I hoped the past would be behind me. But Jake didn't forget. Emily looked at the police car passing by with Carol in it. 15 years he's been looking for you. Thought you helped cover up his brother's murder. And he found you. Plotted his revenge. Decker looked at his daughter. Used you to get to me. Not everything was a lie, Emily said quietly. He started to have doubts at the end. When he called that night, he said his feelings for me were real, despite the original plan. Do you believe him? I don't know. She turned away to the window. But I want to. Otherwise, everything that's happened between us. Her voice shook. The sheriff put his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. Whatever it was, he didn't deserve to die. Carol had no right to decide for all of us. At that moment, Detective Chang approached the car. Sheriff, can I talk to you for a minute? Decker got out of the car. They walked a few steps away, speaking in low voices, but Emily could still hear their conversation. They found something else in Jake's trailer, Chang said. A hidden camera. It recorded his murder. The sheriff tensed up. The tape confirms Carol's confession. She came to him, told him what she'd seen that night at the lake. Jake was shocked. The detective checked her notes. His last words. I've been wrong about Decker all these years. I need to tell Emily the truth. And that's when Carol shot him, the sheriff finished grimly. Yes, she said. Some secrets must stay buried. Chung put the notebook away. There's more. The camera kept recordings of his conversations with Emily and his monologues when he was alone. About what? About how he started falling in love with your daughter, how it conflicted with his revenge plan. The detective looked at the sheriff carefully. He did love her, Sheriff. At the end, he couldn't go on with his plan any longer. Decker nodded silently and walked back to the car. Emily looked at him expectantly. What did she say? The sheriff paused for a moment, then said quietly, Jake recorded his murder and a lot of other things, including his real feelings for you. Emily held her breath. He loved you, the sheriff said simply. Despite everything he'd originally planned, in the end, he no longer wanted revenge. He only wanted the truth. Emily stared out the window in silence. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. Her mind reeled with fragments of memories, their meetings, their conversations, their touches. Everything that had seemed real had turned out to be false, and now it was changing again. I'm sorry, Father said quietly. I'm sorry that my past ruined your present. It wasn't your fault, she shook her head. You were trying to protect me. You always have. Perhaps too much, Decker smiled guiltily. If I hadn't kept you in a golden cage all these years, if I'd told you the truth sooner. There's nothing you can do about it. Emily finally turned to her father. Jake's dead. Carol's been arrested. The ghosts of the past finally came out into the light. They sat in silence, watching the police cars leave Carol Baker's house one by one. Other people's secrets, carefully kept for 15 years, had ruined several lives in a matter of days. What now? Emily asked as the last car rounded the corner. Now, the sheriff started the engine. We learn to live with the truth, no matter how bitter it is. The car pulled away, leaving behind a house that held its part of a long history. A road to the unknown lay ahead. But at least now they were walking it without the weight of the lies that had been weighing them down all this time.